Hi, my name is John. I'm a history professor in a liberal arts college in the center of Kentucky, and today I want to talk about Nazis, or at least I want to talk about how I plan to talk about Nazis in one of my classes next week. So, Center College, where I teach, has a special term every January. Other colleges have them too. They're called J terms at some places. We just call ours Center term, where the students pick one class, and for 3 weeks, that's the only class they do. And I have them for 3 hours a day. And so I typically do that to do a lot of project work with them, which maybe I'll talk about in a future video. But it's also a great time to kind of experiment or do some fun things. In the past, I've taught classes about East Asian spirituality, where they've made podcasts about ghost stories. I teach a class quite regularly called History and Video Games, where they make video games based on an historical setting. And this year, I want to talk about kind of what I call popular history. Well, not just me, what many people call popular history, the kind of history as is presented to people in much more kind of mass media situations, in works of art, projects and products and so on that are really created primarily to entertain. So, for example, an example I often give my students is the Game of Thrones books, the Song of Ice and Fire books, where, as my British historian friend would point out, it's War of the Roses all the way down. And for me, I'm an East Asia specialist, and I teach global history as well. Khal Drogo and these horsemen from the East. I mean, it's not subtle what he's doing. It's not trying to be subtle either. But I'll talk a little bit about, how do we understand something like that? Does Khal Drogo and all his people, and then when Khaleesi takes them over and everything, to what extent is that fictional depiction confirming ideas you may have about the Mongol Empire without thinking about it, or is it creating new kind of associations, that kind of a thing? So I'm going to talk about the Nazis next week because I was always going to. They're kind of an obvious group to talk about in that sense. They're very kind of present in the culture. Almost exclusively for good reasons, that is to say, to decry them or to denounce them or to see them as purely negative. Although I will say, in kind of recent months, in the last year or two or so, there's been some kind of concerning stuff. So the Manhattan Institute did a poll recently, a few weeks ago, of young conservatives, where some of those people being polled were willing, or in a focus group, I should say, were willing to say either positive or like, oh, he's, you got to hand it to kind of comments about Hitler, which on the one hand, I don't want to get too worried about that kind of thing because, I teach lots of conservative students. I'm not noticing a major uptick in Hitler sympathy. I grew up around a lot of conservative people who were definitely not Hitler sympathetic. In fact, very much the opposite. Having said that, it feels a little alarming that it's even okay to kind of talk about him at all, or to say, well, these are the good things he did, or something like that. So that's concerning to me. Another concerning element for me is this figure, Curtis Yarvin, who is quite popular on the internet, who likes to share theories about World War II that are wrong. And I'm not sure if he ever bothered with the whole, there are different ways to approach the history, and here's my approach. I don't know. I'm not sure if he ever went through that phase, but now he just says, oh, yeah, everyone agrees that the Nazis didn't have a plan to conquer the world. Which is, untrue. He's incorrect about that. And there's a lot of people on the internet, not all of whom are worth listening to, but very powerful people do listen to him, and he's an influential guy, and he's getting interviews in the New York Times and everything else. So that's there. That's kind of in our culture at the moment. All of which is to say, I'm not going to do a 30-minute version of what I just said to my students next week. That's not really how history classes work or supposed to work. But it gives me personally an extra kind of layer of motivation to be thinking about, well, how do we approach this and how do we talk about it? So, and there's lots and lots of ways to talk about Nazis. But what I plan to do in class is kind of present two kind of, two angles. I wish to kind of talk about them. The first is to look at how they show up in our culture as just the bad guys, like just unquestionably evil, even cartoonishly evil or bad, the kind of Indiana Jones kind of Nazi.
Guten Tag, Herr Jones.
To which I'm fairly partial. I quite like that approach to Nazism. I quite like that approach to, like, they're just bad and that's it. And everyone knows they're bad, and it's a shorthand for bad. But of course, when you're teaching traditional age college students, which I am almost exclusively, they've grown up in a different kind of an environment. So when I was growing up in the 1980s, I mean, my grandfather lived through World War II. in Ireland, but still, he lived through it. I grew up with these stories, these memories, and culture at that time produced with the assumption of the evils of Nazism, and you don't need to kind of prevaricate or kind of figure it out. So I think that's the first thing I'd like to do, and kind of model for them. Hey, when I, as an historian, approach something like Indiana Jones: The Raiders of the Lost Ark, what can I get out of it? Here's what I notice about the depiction of the Nazis. Here's what we know is reminiscent of what they were actually like, or what they claimed to be like, or what they aspired to be, and everything else. The second kind of way, the second kind of model for looking at them is, as just the depths of Nazi horror, the sheer inhumanity of them, which of course is most clearly embodied in the Holocaust. And we may or may not do a bit of a Spielberg kind of a thing, where Spielberg does Raiders of the Lost Ark, and then only just over a decade later, he does Schindler's List. And so you have these two very different kind of approaches to thinking about Nazism, to thinking about evil, really. And I think that's a very influential thing. Spielberg has a movie coming out now in a few months, has a genuine claim to being the most important American director of the last 50 years. There's a lot of competition, a lot of good American directors. He's certainly been hugely influential. He was very influential in the 1980s and 1990s in particular, which is something someone my age, in my 40s, takes for granted. But again, a 20-year-old is going to think about Spielberg in a different way. Although one of the cool things about classes like this are that you're always a little bit surprised by what people bring into the class with them. So the nice thing about teaching at a place like Centre, so I have 30 people in this class next week, which are as big as classes can get, is there's a lot of space there to say, hey, what do you think? What do you think about Nazism? How have you encountered it? Do you have a film you like, or a video game you like, or a book you like that features a Nazi character or a fake Nazi character or something like that? And you can be surprised, because it all depends, what they've encountered themselves, or what an uncle or a mother or a grandparent or whomever has sat down with them and said, hey, watch this cool thing with me. And before you know it, you have a 20-year-old massive Indiana Jones fan on your hands in the year 2025. Like, these things happen all the time. So I'm excited to kind of go there and kind of see, where that takes us. There's lots of other things you could talk about the Nazis, particularly, of course, in popular culture. I would think I probably will talk to them a little bit about the British post-war kind of set of ideas around Nazism, which kind of fits neatly with a kind of a very gentle-ish British kind of jingoism. I'll show them Basil Fawlty goose-stepping through the dining room as the German guests are horrified. I might show them the picture of the brother of the future king wearing a Nazi armband to a party. And just to talk a little bit about kind of this interesting kind of fusion the British can sometimes do of, we're going to ridicule them, but also we recognize them as horrible, and I do think the power of ridicule is very important, and I'm partial to that myself. But in the last few years, in our public discourse here in the United States and across the Western world as a whole, that's been going lots of different places. You've got the punch a Nazi kind of an idea and kind of a meme, right? And you have this sense of like, well, how do we engage with public figures who appear to be kind of winking at, or kind of, giving a sideways glance towards fascism, basically. And then also in the popular culture, I think of machine games, and the recent Wolfenstein, or over the last decade, the revival of the Wolfenstein series. And they've gone for a very intentionally stylized, hyper-violent, aggressive take on the kind of treatment that Nazis deserve, I suppose, or that Nazism, the kind of the just how short the shrift should get, I suppose, for Nazism. Again, something of which I strongly approve. So I'm excited to see how it goes. It's certainly not the only thing. It's kind of a thematic course. We're going to do Nazis. We're going to do Irish nationalism, because I know a little bit about that. We're going to do authoritarianism in China specifically, because I know a lot about that, specifically thinking about kind of, the imperial period and things like that. And I'm going to make some more of these videos and share them. And my students are going to make videos as well, which I plan to share on this channel. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, and particularly if you like the Wolfenstein talk and you want more video game talk in the future, give it a like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And thanks for watching.